Welcome to Biblically Grounded. I'm your host, Clayton Van Huss, and we're excited today to have our friend, Dr. Titus Kennedy, back on the program to talk about more archaeology. And today we're going to be talking about the archaeology of Jesus. Dr. Kennedy, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
No, it's very exciting. So, the last time we got together, we talked about the Exodus, we talked about the Soleb inscription and your adventures there. But now let's turn a little bit to the New Testament. We, we know the Bible's written over a longer period of time, and so we're going to move from the Bronze Age to the Roman period. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself. For those who don't know you, you're an archaeologist, you are an explorer, you are a teacher, you are an apologist, many different things. So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I do field archaeology, as you mentioned, but I also teach as a professor. I write, do research, and try to get all those things together that are connecting to archaeology and archaeology of the Bible specifically. So I worked on several different excavations and archaeological surveys and just trying to answer some of the difficult questions about exactly how this evidence fits into the biblical narrative or clarify some things that are difficult.
Yeah, so why is that important? As a believer, I have the Bible, and it tells me about Jesus. It tells me about what he did, and a little bit about the time period. Why is it important for me to maybe understand the context of the world around him, or to have archaeology that talks about him? I mean, I believe, so why do I need this?
Well, from the most basic standpoint, we need to have reasons to believe, reasons that we believe, not just based on a feeling and not just because someone told us that it's true or this happened. If it's reality, then there should be some evidence left behind. And our faith, indeed, Christianity is a historical faith. It's rooted in reality. And it's important for us to not just know that, but to know about that, know what the reasons are. And then the second thing that you mentioned is understanding that ancient context, because the Bible was not written in the 21st century. It was written in a long time ago in a land far, far away, of course, over many different years and different periods. But if we try to project our current times and culture onto the reading of the Bible, then we're going to misinterpret it. So we need to understand the original setting and the audience that was written to and the authors and what kind of world they lived in order for us to properly interpret and understand it.
Yeah, the old adage that the Bible was written for us, but it was not necessarily written to us. And so, yeah, how many times do I read something in there and I think, what is going on here? I'm not understanding what they're saying. And then a little bit of cultural and historical illumination, and I go, I get it. That makes sense now. So great. Now that we're ready for that, let me ask you the question, and we hear this, especially those who are involved in apologetics, which you're very familiar with. So we hear often that Jesus probably is fictional. He never existed. He's just made up, and so why bother? Why study? Why believe? So does this claim have any basis?
No, it doesn't, even though it gets repeated and is one of those things that seems to be sort of popular knowledge. Maybe we could call it urban myth even. And if you go and talk to experts, professors, archaeologists, ancient historians who teach at universities or dig in the Roman period, they know that there is evidence that a historical Jesus existed. They know that he wasn't just some myth that was created later on. And in fact, we have 11 different sources, written sources from the first and second century that mention Jesus Christ. And so we have even these contemporary accounts. Some are historians, some are philosophers, in addition to the Gospels and the New Testament and later Christian writings, Christian history, church history that tell us things about Jesus and that, of course, he was a real person.
Okay, so as Bible believers, of course, we believe. Do secular scholars also believe that Jesus was a historical person?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few fringe scholars who are Jesus mythicists who claim that Jesus didn't exist and was a myth, but this is outside of the realm of mainstream secular scholarship.
Okay, so then believers and secular non-believers, when it comes to biblical scholars or scholars of that time and place, we have an agreement that Jesus was an historical person. So you and I would make the claim that Jesus isn't just someone who was an historical person, but that he is today alive and at the right hand of the Father. My mentor taught me. He said, maybe I can prove to you that Jesus existed. He said, but as an archaeologist, what I cannot prove to you is that he died and rose again, and lives in heaven now. He died to forgive your sins. So that is where we have to take his words and his teachings and weigh them. But historically, we have a lot of evidence he existed, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. From ancient historical manuscripts to inscriptions to archaeological discoveries of various buildings that are mentioned in the Gospels, many people and events that are documented in the Gospels. All these things put together show us that the four Gospels are very well historically and archaeologically attested, very historically reliable documents.
Good. Dr. Kennedy, this is something you know a good bit about because you have written a book about the archaeological evidence for Jesus. Can you tell us about this book and some of the research that you put into this?
This book is called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and it focuses on the archaeology connected to Jesus Christ and the Gospels. This was a culmination of many years of research and teaching and excavation. So I've excavated some of the places that Jesus was during the first century, as well as doing photography and research and teaching on this subject. And I wanted to put it together in one place in chronological order. So it's sort of a logical historical progression that people could read through. And what I found along the way over the years is that there's just an incredible amount of information that attests to the reliability of the Gospels and the existence of Jesus in the first century.
Oh, that is great. So I don't want to waste much time in this. I want to get into the evidence. And so, as an archaeologist, of course, a lot of people you want to know exactly what that is. You're digging, you are excavating, and looking for evidence of human civilization. And it's a branch of anthropology where we're studying human history, human existence, but we're looking at the material culture here. And by material culture, I mean things. Like if you walk around your house, you might have something like a cell phone or a coffee mug or something like that, that thousands of years from now would be considered an artifact. And so archaeologists are systematically excavating and documenting everything. Can you tell us a little bit about the process, Dr. Kennedy, of you're not just digging up treasures. This is not Indiana Jones, even though those movies are a lot of fun to watch and I enjoy them. What are we doing as archaeologists?
Well, we are carefully documenting the past. And when we're doing an excavation, we have everything set out in a grid. We lay out squares to excavate. And as we dig down, not only are we recording everything that we find and where we find it and photographing it, drawing it, but we're excavating in a systematic way, kind of like peeling back layers, because we want to dig in the same time period without jumbling up different eras. And so we're not just going to dig a hole. We're going to sort of peel back these layers. Some people use the illustration of a layered cake, maybe like also like peeling an onion, something like that. Really,
Yeah.
really paying attention, doing this carefully and recording everything, because we may not realize at the time, but later on, as we're processing and researching and looking at other finds and studies, that something that we didn't notice as being important actually really helps us to understand history better.
Yeah, this is an important, very methodical scientific process, and in fact, I think we spend a lot more time in books and reading and writing than in getting our hands dirty. So there's adventure, but there's also a lot of work, a lot of scholarship that goes into this. And Dr. Kennedy, you're one of those scholars. And so you've done this research on the evidence for Jesus for your book, and about excavating the evidence for Jesus. Can you start us off by telling us what sorts of evidence exist outside of the Bible for the existence of Jesus?
First, we've got what we talked about earlier, and that is these ancient documents, these ancient sources that mention Jesus Christ and something about his life from the first and second century. So that's really important to have this, so to speak, outside corroboration about Jesus and different aspects of his life. And then we have some different categories of archaeology. So we might divide that up into things like places, people, and in some cases even events that we can see in the archaeological record. So basically all of the places mentioned in the gospel are known and have been identified archaeologically. Very rarely do we even have a location where there's some dispute over if that's been found or which site it is. Something like Emmaus, for example, there's some dispute over exactly where that site was located, but all of the main places in the Gospels, whether it's Bethlehem or it's Nazareth or it's Capernaum, even Cana, I think is well established now as well. All these places, we know where they are. There's been some archaeological work done. We see that there are remains there from the time of Jesus that matches that these places were occupied at the time of the Gospels. And in some cases, we can say that we've even found the buildings that are mentioned in the Gospels, things like the synagogue in Capernaum or the house of Peter.
Yeah,
So
okay,
it's
so
quite incredible.
yeah, both of these structures that you were just mentioned, they are in the same place. In fact, you can like throw a baseball back and forth between the two. And I think it's fascinating when the Bible tells us that they were in the synagogue and that they walked to Peter's house. And you can stand there and say, okay, yeah, I can see Peter's house. So we have these two locations, the synagogue and what we believe is the house of Peter. Is this just tradition? Because, anyone who's been to the Holy Land hears a lot about tradition. Do we base this on tradition, or are there evidences in these structures that give us some surety as to what they are.
Well, there certainly is archaeological evidence for both of these structures, although I would say that tradition is not a bad thing. You know, historical tradition can be very useful, and it is based on something. Now, in the case of the House of Peter, we do have ancient church tradition, pilgrimage accounts, and so forth, going back to the early Byzantine period. But we have archaeological evidence as well. Now, the synagogue, I think, is very obvious. So there's a fourth and fifth century synagogue that is built over the top of the first century synagogue, and the coins and the pottery that were found in excavations of parts of the first century synagogue show that it was built and in use in the first century, the early first century, specifically when Jesus would have been there. The house of Peter also was a house that was inhabited at probably the first century BC, possibly even slightly earlier. But then we see a change in it in the late first century. It's no longer just used as a house. It's not somebody's residence. It gets used as some sort of meeting place, and then the walls get plastered over. And then starting in the second century, we see a lot of Christian inscriptions on the walls. Many of them are praising Jesus, so we know that it's basically a early church building. But there are two that mention Peter. One is in Greek and one is in Latin, and the Latin one gives his association with Rome, where of course he went later, and that's where he was martyred. So we have information from just the archaeology of the structure, from the inscriptions that are there, from early pilgrim accounts, and then in its general description in the Bible as well. So I think the argument for both of those structures is quite strong for them being identified.
Wow, that is really cool. So right there in one place we have these two structures. Now Jesus spent a lot of his time in that region. So much of his ministry happened just along that shore of the Sea of Galilee. And you talk about structures that we can associate with Jesus. There's also the synagogue or possibly synagogues. And I've seen both of those structures. In fact, the main one, the well-known synagogue of Magdala, is one of the things that really got me interested in archaeology as a tourist to Israel. So can you tell us anything about the site of Magdala?
Magdala is a fairly recent excavation, but it is mentioned once in the Gospels. It doesn't seem like Jesus really spent time there, but of course it was around. The synagogue that you mentioned was an incredibly important find because it was a very well preserved synagogue from the first century, and really showed clearly to people what these looked like at the time of Jesus and in the first century. So it's a good model for comparison. Now, there are several other synagogues known from the first century now, and the way that the Gospels talk about, oh, yes, there was a synagogue here and here and here, that is something that used to get more pushback than it does now because of the recent discovery of multiple synagogues in Judea and Galilee.
Yeah, yeah, there was some argumentation as to whether this system, this kind of rabbinical synagogue system even existed at the time of Jesus. But archaeology is illuminating that the authors of the Gospels knew exactly what they were talking about. So, what are some of the other evidences? We have sites, we have buildings. What else do we have that points to the historicity of Jesus?
Well, many of the people that are mentioned in the gospel narratives are attested through archaeology. We might say people like Pontius Pilate, or Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, or Annas, the former high priest. Uh, we also have people like Simon, who helped Jesus carry the cross. So, we could go through many, many people, and some of them are very important from a political or religious standpoint, and some of them are lesser known people. But that's another category of corroboration in addition to all these locations or these structures.
Interesting. So we have the evidence of architecture and locations, and then we have the evidence of artifacts. You mentioned Pilate, Simon, and Caiaphas. What can you tell us about some of that physical evidence of those people?
Typically, we're talking about inscriptions that were made at the time that those people were alive and that they held a particular position, especially in the case of Pilate. So the most well-known of his inscriptions is called the Pilate Stone, found at Caesarea or Caesarea, and it gives his name, Pontius Pilatus, and his title, prefect of Judea. But then there's other things that were left behind by his administration, like the coins that he minted while he was governor, or the ring that was found at Herodium, probably used by one of his officials. There's an inscription that was discovered in Italy that's currently lost, but also seems to be referring to Pilate holding a minor Roman government position. And then we've got him mentioned in some of the writings of ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus and so forth. So really, really strong for people like him. For others like Annas, it's a little more nuanced. Annas is mentioned in the writings of Josephus, for example, and I would say we know where his tomb is as well. It's right in the same location that Josephus says, and it's the most elaborate tomb of that period. But to date, there hasn't been an inscription found in the tomb that says, that it's Annas, the high priest.
Hmm. Okay, so that's interesting. But now we do have an inscription from that family of someone else who is in the Bible, correct? Not just an inscription, but an inscription on an artifact.
Yeah, and that's his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was the acting high priest during the ministry and trial of Jesus. And that was found in the family tomb of the Caiaphas family. So his first name was Joseph. So he was Joseph, son of Caiaphas, the high priest. And we've got his ossuary now, thanks to excavations of that tomb. And it's probably the most elaborately decorated ossuary from that period.
Now you're
So very,
using a
very
big word
fitting.
here. I hate to interrupt you, but what's an ossuary?
An ossuary, good point. That is basically a bone box. So these were used in Judea and Israel, primarily during the Roman period, mostly first century BC until 70 or 130, depending on the area. And people would bury someone either in a tomb or in the ground. And then about a year later, they would go back and they would collect the bones, and then they would put the bones in this box to preserve them for future resurrection was the idea. And often, but not always, they would inscribe the person's name on that bone box, on this ossuary. Sometimes they would inscribe the name of their father or the type of profession that they worked in, or sometimes the place that they were from. And so there's ways to identify them. It's not just a bunch of first names and we're guessing. Usually we have some good extra information where we can see, okay, this correlates with this person that we read about in other historical sources.
Yeah, and that also helps us a little sidetrack to illuminate some of the things we read in Scripture. So a body was placed in a tomb and allowed to decay, and then I understand it was the son who came in, or someone would come in and take the bones and put them in these boxes sometime later. And so we see this as a common burial practice at the time of Jesus. And I think that helps to illuminate when we read about the disciple who said to Jesus, "Well, first let me bury my father." Likely, this man was already dead, and the son was waiting for the body to decompose before he put it. And Jesus answers, "You will let the dead bury the dead." So that kind of indicates that this guy was already dead. And what maybe to our modern ears sounds a little harsh, a little difficult, all of the sudden makes sense with these historical archaeological illuminations. So, we've looked at the land a bit, some of the sites, and some of the architecture, some of the buildings that we believe Jesus would have been in, that the Bible talks about. We've looked at some of the pieces that deal with, when I say pieces, artifacts that deal with people who the Bible talks about. How cool is that to be able to actually verify, to actually show that the Bible is talking about real people who lived and breathed and walked in these real places? So how sure can we be then when we read the accounts in the gospel that they're talking about real things Jesus did?
Well, we've got hundreds of discoveries now, and so you could go through, read the Gospels, and in so many cases, there's some type of archaeological correlation, whether it's a town or it's a type of boat that was used, or it's a specific building that's been excavated, or if it's a person for whom we have archaeological evidence, or it's a custom and we've got material culture of that custom, or we've got historical writings that discuss it. And all of this goes together and just continues to show time and time again that the Gospels have this incredible historical accuracy. They were written by people who were eyewitnesses of the events and lived in those places and saw these things and knew those people. And that's how they're able to get all these details into the narrative, and everything is correct. And so I think that's what we're going to continue to see as more archaeology is done, is more confirmation of the accuracy of the Gospels.
Well, that is fascinating to me that we can actually dig up things that point to actual moments, actual times, and that the more we find, the more that we have, that we find that what we find in the ground matches what we read in the scriptures and in the gospel accounts of Jesus. So beyond simply not simply, but beyond the places Jesus walked and the people who are mentioned, what else do we see that helps to corroborate the gospel writers' accounts?
Oh, we could look at some traditions. Uh, we talked about burials earlier, but specifically, we could look at the way that Jesus was buried. And what happens? He's crucified, and then they take his body off the cross. They ask Pilate for his body, and then they go and bury him in this specific type of tomb. Well, from archaeology, we know now that in Jerusalem, from the pre-70 AD, in the time of Jesus, that Jews who were crucified were allowed to be given a proper burial in a family tomb. We know this from the ossuary, or the tomb of Yehohanan, who was also a crucifixion victim in the first century of Jerusalem, and he was placed in his family's tomb, and he was placed in the ossuary with his name inscribed there. So this is a detail, political and cultural, that the Gospels get right. And then the Gospels talk about the tomb of Jesus, how it was carved out of the rock, and there was a burial bench inside the tomb, and just this one chamber, and it was sealed with this big stone. Well, that is the same type of tomb that we see in Judea and Galilee from the first century, that were used by wealthy families that were Jews. And so that's exactly what we would expect to find, and we do find those types of tombs. In fact, the The tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre fits that profile as well. You also have things like the stone water pots that are used in the ritual purification. And we see some of this reference in not only John, but Mark as well. And that's something that we find at archaeological sites where Jews were living that observed the Mosaic law, because this factored into ritual purification in the Mosaic law. So many, many other details like that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And those stone ritual stone vessels. In my first day of digging, first dig ever, the first artifact that I uncovered was a handle from one of those stone vessels. And because I'd seen them and worked with some museum items, I knew exactly what it was when I picked it up, and that is a really cool thing. So, what are some of the things that we see in the Gospels, maybe leading up to, say, the trial of Jesus? Is there any evidence that the Bible gets that right?
I think the trial narrative in the Gospels is one of the best attested events archaeologically of anything in the Bible. And we could look at all four Gospels together. We could look at an individual. I find John particularly interesting because John, of course, is unique. He has a lot of different content than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he talks about all these different places that are not even mentioned in the other gospels, places like the pool of Bethesda, which has been excavated, and the pool of Siloam, also fairly recently excavated and still being worked on, or Jacob's well in the area of Shechem, which you can go see today. But then we get into the trial of Jesus narrative, and he even has some different locational geographic details in there, because not only does John mention the praetorium where Jesus goes before Pilate, but he also mentions this Gabbatha and then the stone pavement. And those are details that are not given in the other gospels. Well, Gabbatha, that's this Aramaic name for raised place. And it seems like he's talking about this platform that the bema was on, the judgment seat. And then there's this stone pavement that's on the top of that platform. And we see the bema talked about in the other gospel trial narratives as well. So, we know where in the story this is going and that it's in the praetorium. But John gives us some extra details. Well, if you fast forward in time to the 1970s, there was an excavation outside the walls, or even on the walls of Jerusalem, along the western side of the city, south of Jaffa Gate. And this was right around the place where the former palace of Herod the Great was. And that palace was taken over by the Romans as the praetorium, or the governor's mansion.
Yeah,
And
that's
when
an
this was,
Yeah, I was going to say, for anyone who has visited Jerusalem or who is planning to, this is not a site that gets pointed out. And if you have a chance to go, there are steps there where you can climb. This is just one of those things right in that later period wall, though, that it in that area appears to be the spot. And I hate to interrupt you, but that was a neat site to get to visit and to see. And I hope that our viewers have that opportunity.
yeah, I wish that more people knew about it, but it seems like tour guides almost never take people to that. But it's easy to find, so you just walk south along the wall and you'll get to it. And as you said, there's steps. It's a very obvious site. But if you look at it, you see where this raised place is and where the bema was. And if you go on top of that, then you can see some of the stone pavement is still there. So this got covered over, probably during the destruction of Jerusalem, and afterwards. And it really wasn't uncovered again until the 70s. So all the rubble, dirt, and everything preserved part of this praetorium for millennia. And now we can see one of the areas where Jesus went during the trial, and how John gets these details right and telling us that he was an eyewitness. He was there. He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, these eyewitness accounts in the gospel are, I think they're fascinating. That in the Gospels we have these writers, some of which are eyewitnesses, and some of which are talking to eyewitnesses, and so but they work together. The evidence seems to. And what would you say to those who say, yeah, but there are contradictions between what this gospel writer says and what this gospel writer says? Are there contradictions there, or is this something else?
I see that as we're getting accounts from different people, different perspectives that are overlapping. So sometimes they're giving you exactly the same content and details. Other times, a little bit of it's the same, and then there's supplementary information. And so if you put them all together, you get a fuller picture. But this is actually a category of study that some people call undesigned coincidences, where they see that in the case of books like the Gospels, we've got four different accounts, how there are places where they fit together so perfectly, and and yet this is not something that the authors would have or could have designed. This is a sign instead of eyewitness testimony. And it's just like when witnesses go on the stand in the courtroom and they're all talking about the same event that they saw, but they're giving some slightly different details. And that then tells the whole picture of the story.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an important thing to remember, that different people see different things. And I think, to me, one of the interesting things that you read is in the four different gospel accounts, the different things that are written on the sign over Jesus' head on the cross. And I've seen that one used as a tool, as a weapon to attack the veracity of Scripture, to say, oh, look, they all say something slightly different. They don't have the exact same thing said on them. But we see, well, yeah, but we can put together the whole saying by looking at, Jesus the King of the Jews, or this is Jesus, or in three different languages. And when we pull them together, when we look at these gospel accounts written by these four different men, we can pull together and weave this tapestry of what happened. That's beautiful. What do we see um, after the time of Jesus' ministry on earth? What sorts of evidences that the people were aware that Christianity wasn't just some religion that popped out of nowhere? Do we see any evidence of, we talked about Peter's house, but outside of that, do we see evidences of early Christian worship, of beliefs maybe outside of the immediate area where Jesus ministered?
We do. And I would say some of the most obvious evidence from that actually comes from different historians, especially Roman historians, who are often criticizing or attacking Christianity. But we do see Christian symbols found in various parts of the Roman world, at least as early as the second century, maybe in some cases earlier. We see other house churches, meeting places, some in Rome. Of course, we've got Capernaum. I would say in Jerusalem, the Church of the Apostles on Mount Zion, the upper room church. And then we could also go and look at symbols. When do the cross symbols start coming into use? Or maybe the Alexamenos graffito that was found in Rome from about 100 AD to 200 AD. And it shows that these everyday Romans know about Christianity and the crucifixion of Jesus, and they're actually insulting Jesus and insulting Christians from a very early period. So I think the evidence is really strong that Christianity spread far and wide and very quickly.
No, this is great. And you've compiled so many. We could talk on these different artifacts and locations and inscriptions, especially that last one. I find that one fascinating. All of these things we've talked about, we could do full episodes on just the individual artifacts. What in your research and as you were writing, what was probably your favorite piece that if I said, tell me one thing that shows that Jesus was real, what would be the one thing you would say, look at this?
Well, one of my favorite artifacts is the Nazareth inscription. Although if I was being asked, is Jesus real? I would point to the James ossuary. I think that one's incredibly important. We've got a pre-70 AD Aramaic inscription that mentions Jesus as the brother of James and the son of Joseph. But yeah, the Nazareth inscription intrigued me because it's it's a little cryptic in some ways, and also there's been some controversy or some attacks on it as far as where it was sourced from and who it's talking about. But to me, I think that it is the Roman attestation of Matthew 28, where they're talking about how, all right, the Roman soldiers have come. The body of Jesus is gone from the tomb. And so the religious leaders say, here's some money. Go tell people that the disciples of Jesus stole the body. And this is the story that is spread until this day. And that's what we see on the Nazareth inscription, is that the Romans were saying that the tomb was broken into and people stole the corpse with wicked intent. They had some motive behind this. And then they imposed the death penalty for that. And so they want to put a stop to anything like that happening. Why? Because Christianity has had such a massive impact on the Roman Empire already.
Yeah, otherwise, why would Roman officials care about grave robbers? I mean, isn't this just a thing that, yeah, okay, you deal with that. But this inscription really puts some weight on that with the death penalty.
Right. And typically people are breaking into graves or tombs or sarcophagi because they want to take some coins that are in there or some jewelry or pottery, something of value, not a decaying corpse. But this particular Roman edict is specifically discussing the removal of a corpse from a tomb and with some intent behind it, wicked intent. So it's not a normal robbery.
Yeah, yeah, that is really something. So somewhere there was an empty tomb where something happened the Romans didn't like that threatened them. The dealing with an empty tomb, and very interesting that the inscription is found in the hometown of Jesus in Nazareth. Yeah. So, Dr. Kennedy, we thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell our viewers where they can find out more about you, what they can do to learn more about the archaeology of Jesus?
Well, as we mentioned, I wrote a book on this topic called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and that's available in bookstores and online. So you can find it, order it if you want it in hard copy or electronic if you prefer that. Uh, Talks a little bit about me and the author bio, but also on my faculty pages, you can find more of my articles and publications.
Okay, so your faculty pages with which institutions?
With Biola, with Shepherd Seminary, with Dallas Theological Seminary, and also Discovery Institute.
Excellent. Well, Titus, thank you so much for being our guest today. We've learned a lot from you, and I hope that we can have you back before too much time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you. My pleasure being here.
Yeah, and thank you for watching this episode of Biblically Grounded.